Welcome to the Chemical Safety Flammables Liquids webinar. I'll be your host this morning. My name is Zara McMahon and I'm the Office Coordinator at Safety Action. Let me explain the administration for the webinar. If you have any specific questions during the webinar, you can ask these by typing in the questions panel and we'll do our best to answer these. I would like to introduce our presenter, Andrea Tassioulas, General Manager at Safety Action. Andrea has a Bachelor of Science, graduate diploma in Occupational Hazard Management, and is a certified OHS professional. Andrea has 12 years experience conducting chemical safety inspections, advising on chemicals and preparing chemical registers, dangerous goods manifests, and chemical safety training. Andrea, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Today, I would like to give you some tips on storing flammable liquids. Firstly, I'll share with you a couple of basic principles about chemical storage. These apply to all chemicals, and then I'll talk about some specifics that are important when you're storing flammable liquids. The main storage for flammables that I'll be talking about today relates to smaller quantities, which in the Australian standard would be called minor storage. But the same principles do apply to larger quantities, but there will also be additional requirements when you have large quantities of flammable liquids, for example, in bulk vessels. Okay, so for what these would require apply to all chemicals is that wherever possible they should be kept in their original labelled container. All chemicals, this is just good housekeeping and workplace practice, that they should all have a designated storage location. All chemicals should be stored in accordance with the chemicals safety data sheet, which means it's important to check in the safety data sheet about the storage requirements and any chemicals that this should be, or conditions that these chemicals should be stored away from. And almost all chemicals should be stored away from heat and sunlight. Some more common requirements. Of course, all containers should be labelled. So if the chemical is decanted out of its original container into a new container, it's very important to confirm the container is compatible and suitable for the type of chemical that you are transferring it into. And then, of course, you need to label that container that you've decanted the chemical into. And all chemical containers should be kept tightly closed. Now, some specific requirements for storing flammable liquids. Flammable liquids, all of them need to be kept away from ignition sources and, of course, smoking areas. Ignition sources, of course, are heat and flames, but some, unless they're specifically designed for flammable liquids areas, lights and light switches can also be ignition sources. So it is worth considering those, especially where you have flammable liquids being handled, so where there may be flammable liquids vapors in the area. And you should also consider bonding and earthing flammable equipment and containers when you're pouring. I'll explain these situations in a moment. Now, good practice when storing chemicals, this again applies to all chemicals, is to limit the amount of chemicals outside of approved cabinets. So some rules of thumb are, if you're working in a laboratory or a factory or other chemical handling area, is that you only keep up to 1 day's supply of chemical on the workbench. You then keep, you might have up to 1 week's supply in an approved flammable liquids cabinet that may be in your work area, for example, in the workshop or in the laboratory. And quantities exceeding that 1 week supply should be in a designated chemical storage area outside of the main work area, which may be an external store outside of the building. Let me talk to you about flammable liquids cabinets. So like I mentioned, it's recommended that beyond 1 day's supply of chemicals should be stored in an approved flammable liquids cabinet. You'll recognize these flammable liquids cabinets. They're often coloured yellow, sometimes coloured red, and they'll have that flammable liquids class 3 diamond on them. And when I conduct workplace inspections, I commonly find these flammable liquids cabinets are not being used correctly. I'd like to share with you some common problems I find when looking at the flammable liquids cabinet. One of them is that their cabinets are frequently overloaded. You will notice on the cabinet, usually down the bottom, it will state the maximum capacity of the cabinet in litres. It's important to have a look at what that capacity is for your cabinet, and then just check that the amount of flammable liquids that you have in there is not exceeding that capacity. Some people don't know about the bunded area in the flammable liquids cabinet. You'll see on the screen some examples of chemicals in the very bottom of the cabinet. Now, that area is called a bund, and it is designed to hold any spillages of flammable liquids to prevent that spilling out. And the lower shelf should be secured in place so that the shelf cannot be removed easily, and that area should not be used for storage of chemicals. So what you should do is just check that in your cabinet that area is kept clear. Another common problem is the use of storing incompatible items in the flammable liquids cabinet. Now, strictly speaking, according to the Australian Standard for Flammable Liquids, AS 1940, and there's a copy of that Australian Standard there, the Australian Standard does recommend that only flammable liquids be stored inside those cabinets. Now, it's not a safety concern if you were to store other chemicals in there that are compatible with flammable liquids, for example, non-dangerous goods, but it is important to make sure that you don't store any other dangerous goods in there that are incompatible. So, for example, storing of corrosive chemicals in your flammable liquids cabinet is not suitable because corrosive substances, if they spill, can corrode the metal shelving, or they can corrode the flammable liquid containers and create the risk of chemicals mixing together, which could be dangerous. The other thing that it's not recommended to store in your flammable liquids cabinet is obviously combustible materials, but also your personal protective equipment. Because of the flammable liquids vapors in the cabinet or the potential for spills, this could result in the PPE not being clean and hygienic to use. If you store respirators in the cabinet, they won't last as long because the respirators are absorbing the flammable liquids vapors. So store your PPE in a clean, separate location to the cabinet. A couple of other requirements for your cabinets is to make sure that the cabinet self-closing mechanism is operating correctly. What that means is this is to prevent, if there is a fire, the cabinet, or in any case, the cabinet will keep itself closed. So if you open the doors of your flammable liquids cabinet and let go of the doors, the doors should shut close and the cabinet will lock itself. These often do get stuck, so it's worth regularly checking your cabinet to make sure that that door closing and locking mechanism is still functioning correctly. Also, regularly check the condition of the shelves in the cabinet to make sure that they're in good condition and not corroded. A couple more requirements to check on your cabinet. Firstly, they should have the Flammable Liquids Class 3 diamond on the cabinet. They should also have a sign on there that reminds no smoking and no ignition sources within 3 meters. A common question that I'm asked in workplaces is that there is a PowerPoint switch within 3 meters of the cabinet. In the top photo, you'll see a PowerPoint next to the cabinet there. And many people have asked me and told me that due to the size of the room, they're unable to have the cabinet separate from at least 3 meters away from the PowerPoint. And now this is recommended by the Australian standard to keep them 3 meters away from the ignition sources. So certainly if you can achieve that, then it's recommended that you do so. If you are unable to keep the cabinet 3 meters from an ignition source, conduct a risk assessment to confirm what the real risk is of the PowerPoint being near to the flammable liquids cabinet. In the case of the photo on the top on your screen there, if that PowerPoint is not used, a simple solution could be to cover up that PowerPoint and not use it, and then it's not a potential ignition source, because the potential spark would only happen when the PowerPoint is switched on or off. Also check the bottom shelf is fixed in place so that items cannot be stored in the bund of the cabinet. Check that you are not exceeding the displayed maximum capacity of the flammable liquids cabinet. Check that there's no incompatible chemicals in there, as in other classes of dangerous goods, no combustible substances such as cardboard or paper. And check that the door self-closes and self-locks when you let it go. Have a look on your screen and see an example of the signage that should be on the flammable liquids cabinet. Now let me tell you about static electricity. Flammable liquid vapors can catch fire if an electrical charge builds up on with the presence of vapor. So when if the flammable liquids are being poured and you introduce an ignition source, this is when you could create a fire. For this reason, it is important to bond the containers when you're pouring from a metal container. What bonding is connecting the two containers together, the one that you're pouring from and the one that you're pouring into. Note that this is only important when you're pouring from containers that conduct electricity. So if you are pouring from a plastic container, it's not necessary. To also prevent static electricity from causing a fire, if you're pouring metal containers, it's also important to earth or ground the container. So have a look at the image here, the drum that is being poured from. It needs to be earthed to prevent the static electricity from creating a spark and a fire. So you'll see on the left there is a connection from the drum to a pipe, which the pipe conducts electricity and will send any static discharge into the ground, which will prevent us creating a fire. Now, I mentioned earlier about chemicals being incompatible and that it's important not to store flammable liquids with different classes of dangerous goods. showing here on the screen a summary of the different chemicals that are not compatible with flammable liquids. And according to the Australian Standard for Storage of Mixed Classes of Dangerous Goods, it's not recommended that any other chemicals are stored together with flammable liquids. And the chart shows varying distances that they need to be away from, for example, keep apart or segregate. It simply means that they give different distances that they need to be apart from the flammable liquids. And so really, flammable liquids should only be stored together with flammable liquids. So this shows that in your flammable liquids cabinet, you can have other flammable liquids or other compatible non-dangerous goods, but not other classes of dangerous goods. This also applies if you're storing chemicals outside of a flammable liquids cabinet. If you have very small quantities, it's acceptable to do that. You'll see on your screen the fact sheet you can down as a handout, and you can download the flammable liquids cabinet fact sheet that I shared some details of before. Thank you for attending this webinar. If I didn't answer your questions today, feel free to, we will get back to you later, or feel free to email those through later. We'll also send you a survey following the webinar, and we appreciate any feedback that you have to help us improve webinars for the future. You can see on the screen the upcoming chemical safety webinars. You can register for those on our website. Let me show you. There's a section called webinars. If you click on those, that section, it will open up a page listing all the upcoming webinars. If you click on the title of the webinar, it will take you to the GoToWebinar registration page. Feel free to call or email our office if you need help registering for a webinar. Thank you for attending. Have a great day. See you next time. Bye.